More and more kids are being diagnosed with bipolar disease or depression. More and more they're being prescribed very powerful antipsychotic drugs. Is this strategy beneficial or is it reckless?
This is the American Law Journal.
Antipsychotic drugs are designed for serious disorders such as schizophrenia, but today, doctors are prescribing them to children with depression, ADD, yes, even weight problems. But even if this approach is considered by many to be irresponsible, do lawyers have enough legal clout to get very far in court? Good evening and welcome to the initial program in our 18th season on the air. Welcome to the American Law Journal. Very auspicious. Also Constitution Day. And I promise you we'll be tackling numerous constitutional issues throughout this broadcast season. But tonight, a very hot topic, antidepressants, I should say antipsychotics in kids. What are the medical, more importantly for us, what are the legal consequences? Four guests share their views tonight. Two docs, two lawyers. Stephen Scheller has been representing individuals in personal injury and product liability matters now for over 30 years, including those hurt by dangerous medicine. On the other side of the fence, representing the corporations, is Raymond Williams, and he is a partner with Piper DLA, focusing his practice on product liability litigation, especially pharmaceutical and medical device matters. Dr. Rumana Sheikh is with us tonight, a board-certified child psychiatrist affiliated with both Drexel University's College of Medicine and UPenn's Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She's also been widely published in the field of child depression and bipolar disorder. And Dr. Stefan Kruczewski is a psychiatrist and an expert in addictive diseases and neuropsychiatric drugs. A few years ago, he blew the whistle on Pennsylvania's Department of Welfare for systemic pharmaceutical abuse. He was fired, filed a lawsuit, and successfully settled the matter just a few months ago. Folks, we are taking your telephone calls tonight. 1-800-426-4625. There it is in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And once we leave the air tonight at 8:30 p.m., we will continue to take your phone calls in the second half hour. When we discuss antipsychotic drugs, what exactly do we mean? Well, let's take a look here at a definition of what an antipsychotic drug is. It's a group of medications approved for use to treat severe mental disorders, including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And here are a few of the antipsychotics on the market today. Risperdal, produced by Janssen and J&J, Zyprexa, Eli Lilly, Seroquel, produced by AstraZeneca, Geodone, Bristol Myers, Clozaril, and Abilify. Those are just a few of the drugs, again, the antipsychotic drugs we're seeing out there. Now, again, for schizophrenia and severe mental disorders, that's on-label use. But docs have already been prescribing these drugs off-label, meaning that they'll prescribe them to people with depression, attention deficit disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and other problems as well, including weight gain. Dr. Kruczewski, if these drugs have been approved of by the FDA and they're being prescribed by doctors, learned intermediaries, what's the problem?
The number of problems. To start with, the FDA approval is limited to efficacy tests and safety tests in a small and limited number of clinical trials. In the cases of most of the atypical antipsychotics that we're talking about, the FDA approval is limited to schizophrenia, and much later for the approvals came out for bipolar disorder and for maintenance treatment of bipolar disorder. My problem comes with the injudicious use of these medications for off-label purposes for things like you've just cited, attention deficit disorder, anxiety disorder, insomnia, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorders, disorders where there is not excellent evidence that the efficacy outweighs the risks of the prescription of the drugs.
And some of these drugs, for example, Risperdal, I think, was just approved of by the FDA for kids if they're suffering from bipolar disease. But Dr. Sheikh, isn't the evidence still out? We don't have enough evidence in about how kids respond to these drugs. I mean, for many years here in this country, children receiving antidepressants, some of the studies would demonstrate that they couldn't handle these antidepressants. And as a matter of fact, I think in England, they're not even allowed to take any antidepressants or be prescribed antidepressants unless it's Prozac. So why are we giving these kids antipsychotics if indeed much of the evidence is not in yet?
Well, I think that is a very important point that you're bringing up, but I do want to say that Janssen actually has a pretty extensive data set that they presented to the FDA, and these drugs were approved after FDA looked at that data set. Now, I know my colleague, Stefan, when he talked about the on-label use, I think it's very important that we kind of like do realize that there is a subset of children and adults who actually do suffer with serious problems, and there is really nothing much that you can do about it. You can call any diagnosis, you can label it reactive attachment disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Really, the way field of medicine is working today, we are really targeting symptoms. So a lot of these medications, they are helpful, for example, impulsivity or aggression, or you might want to say extreme anxiety or even paranoia. So a lot of these disorders that you talked about, in severe cases, they actually do share all those symptoms that I just mentioned. So there is, I'm not saying that the treatment is drugs only. You cannot use drugs in a vacuum. Drugs needs to be used in collaboration with all other services, and you really need to use them as the last resort after you have failed everything else.
All right, key words, last resort, Steve Scheller.
Let me point out a couple of things. First of all, these drugs are not like antidepressants. They have extremely serious adverse events. They can kill you. They can put you, blitz your brains, and in a very large percentage. In fact, certain type of neurologic diseases are caused by them, tardive dyskinesia, Parkinsonian type syndromes. And they're not just approved for bipolar. They're approved only for severe bipolar. It's called bipolar 1.
Okay.
So there's a confusion going on here. They are not approved for bipolar disorder. Only in the most severe cases, bipolar 1 it's called. Secondly, the doctor's mistaken about the FDA. The FDA is not to be trusted. In Great Britain, Risperdal, they sought, first Janssen brought the Risperdal to be approved. The Great Britain Drug Agency said, we will only approve it if you give much more extensive warnings, if you warn and monitor the drug, and take steps to prevent it being used off-label, take steps for it to being used for anything longer than a few weeks in severe bipolar in children. And you know what Janssen did? They withdrew their British application. They withdrew it. Not only that, but Risperdal causes growth of breasts in children.
So what I would say, though, Steve,
very dangerous
is
drug.
you're the person then that should be trusted. If you don't trust the FDA, who do you trust?
You can't
do we
trust
the plaintiff lawyers? Do we trust the people
frankly,
that
yes.
are... You guys have actually looked at the clinical studies, done the
Yes,
clinical
I have
studies,
looked at them.
reviewed the clinical studies. You were there with the doctors when they were talking to the patients. And the FDA took that information and they made a decision that these drugs should be approved.
The
now,
FDA
we're coming back and second-guessing
you are dead wrong
the
about
FDA.
the FDA.
We're second-guessing.
They cannot be
You're
trusted.
second-guessing.
The Bush FDA is under the control of pharma. There's a guy who runs that named Tom Logren who approved Risperdal for children with autism, even though it causes tardive dyskinesia, even though it causes them to grow breasts.
Do you have a child with autism? Do you have a child with autism? And what that disease does to children, you're not living with that. I have 4 children myself.
Well, I hope you don't use any of these drugs.
Well, I might. I don't know.
Right.
None of them, thank God, have autism.
There's another problem.
But you're not living with that.
He recently approved Zyprexa for children, even though his safety committee said it was based on a fraudulent study done in Russia, and they told him to reject it, and just approved it. The FDA cannot be trusted under the Bush administration. We need to face facts. It is an untrustworthy organization. It is in the business of protecting big pharma, and steps need to be taken to protect the public. And only plaintiff lawyers are the barricade right now to stop what's going on.
Let's take a look at some of these.
I wonder if I could.
And I disagree with the psychiatrists using
Dr.
these drugs on children.
Go ahead first, and then we got a graphic
I'd
here.
like to interject another point, and this is that part of the problem also rests with who's prescribing these medications. Approximately 80%, and those numbers vary, of the antipsychotics and the antidepressants, although we're not specifically talking about that, are being prescribed by general practitioners, by family physicians, by pediatricians. One of the problems that I have with this mass overprescription of medications is that those people are by and large not qualified to understand the clinical literature that supports these drugs. I believe that the literature is also biased in a number of different ways, which this program probably doesn't have enough time to address. But these drugs are potent in the right hands of people like my colleague here today who can determine the risks and the benefits and appropriately and judiciously prescribe them. It makes great sense to use them widely and significantly because these drugs are very helpful. However, for common maladies that have many solutions other than medicinal, prescribing a medicine is often not what is needed, and you run the risk of the problems associated with drugs like Zyprexa and Risperdal and Abilify and Geodon and Seroquel and the newest one, Invega, which is the active metabolite of Risperdal, of having lipid disorders and of having long-term tardive dyskinesia.
What are the psychological consequences? I mean, I've heard about the diabetes and I've heard about the weight gain and young men growing breasts if they take this, possibly. But what are the psychological consequences down the line, doctor?
Are you asking me?
Yes, go ahead.
I think they're significant, and I'll give you an example. I'm a clinician here in Harrisburg. One of the patients I treated, about half my population are people that are drug and alcohol addicted that come for treatment to Harrisburg from Center City, Philadelphia. One of the kids was a 17-year-old African-American male who was being treated with Risperdal, 2 milligrams at night for 3 years, prescribed for sleep. That was the indication, the off-label indication. He developed massive pendulous breasts and lactation. For me, he was embarrassed to take off his shirt. He wouldn't play basketball with his peers.
We've gotten those kinds of stories, and I think it's acknowledged here on the set, at least to a certain degree. But what are the do we know anything about the psychological ramifications? I mean, greater depression, psychotic behavior. Do we find that there's a rebound effect in some of these kids once they try to get off these drugs?
Well, I would say that it is very important that when we prescribe these medications, we actually prescribe them for serious behaviors. I don't think that any trained professional would prescribe Risperdal for insomnia only. So I find it kind of like very hard to believe that this is how medicine is practiced. But
it's happening, Dr. Sheikh, no?
And I see that, okay? It's not that but I cannot judge those people's practices. I can just tell you what I do or what my colleagues do who work where I work. We basically look at these things very seriously, and just like I said before, we recommend non-pharmacological interventions before, including individual therapies, family therapy, wraparound services, school-based programs, other educational interventions, and really medications are used as the last resort, just like I said.
But possibly that's becoming the exception as opposed to the rule. Let's take a look at some statistics, latest statistics dealing with children. And again, prescribing antipsychotics, especially those who have been diagnosed as bipolar. Diagnosis of bipolar disorder in children has risen 4,000% since 1994. Children prescribed antipsychotic drugs jumped 500% in those 7 years, 1995 to 2002, 2.5 million kids on antipsychotics, and then more than 50% of the prescriptions were for ADD and other non-psychotic conditions. So, Dr. Sheikh, once again, we're finding that these kids are receiving antipsychotic drugs. We're seeing many more kids designated or diagnosed as bipolar, and I would think that would have to shock you, and I would think it would shock lawyers here on the set as well.
It doesn't shock me. I've seen it too often. One of the problems is the big pharma, as I now call them. We used to have the military industrial complex. Well, now we have the big pharma. complex with the FDA. And what they've been doing is they've been giving doctors tons of money. There are 3 states that require reporting of payments to doctors by drug companies: Minnesota, Vermont, and Maine. And just recently, the New York Times has done a series of articles. They found that in the case of Vermont, the average psychiatrist gets $45,000 a year from Big Pharma. That's the average psychiatrist. Some of them are getting as much as $500,000. In Minnesota, 1/3 of the psychiatrists were getting more than $50,000 a year from Big Pharma. Now, these, to me, are kickbacks. And we also know from recent studies in the New England Journal, the Cady study, and in the British Medical Journal, that there are alternative medications to use that are equally effective, have, in many instances, less adverse event profile, cost 1/10 of the amount of money.
Steve, I have to step in.
And one of them is your client, Solo, which is actually better.
I have to step in for half a second.
Yes,
There's 2 doctors on this panel, and not one of them has said that the FDA needs to be taken out, or they're not trustworthy, or these drugs should not have been approved. You're the only one that said that.
Yes.
In terms of kickbacks to doctors, again, you're the only one that's saying that.
Well, no,
there is a fact that doctors are actually receiving grants. Yes, I'll give you that, to study drugs. Those are grants. Plaintiff court lawyers like to call them kickbacks. They are given money to present at various conferences. Again, that's called a kickback. It's not called a presentation fee.
But Raymond, if it's $100,000 a year, and I know there have been a couple of studies that come back where doctors made $200,000 in 2 years, that sounds a lot more than just a seminar fee, does it not?
Sure. I would say it's a grant fee.
And
I'd say it's a study fee.
That may, okay, well,
Plus, they've also
and they're helping out. I mean, without clinical trials, how are you going to be able to study these drugs? And doctors get paid for doing the clinical trials.
They've compared the prescribing practices of the doctors with the payments. And they found in all instances, as I understand it, that the prescribing practices of the doctor is commensurate with how much he's been paid.
Oh, okay.
Well, you know,
I've also done studies about.
I would like to interject here.
Go ahead, Dr.
Okay.
Shea. Go ahead. Let's get a medical perspective again here. Go ahead, doctor.
Okay, I think that your point is well taken. The physician-industry relationships, they are concerning, and I think that one needs to look into this, and APA and American Academy of Child Psychiatry is looking into those, and there are guidelines for that. But how many doctors you think are actually taking that money, and how many people are prescribing medication? You know, like if you compare it, it probably wouldn't be like a good ratio there. Now, I do want to address one issue that you talked about, the Cady study. Yes, the Cady study showed that the first-generation antipsychotics, Haldol and Trilofone, they do work. But the reason we moved away from those drugs was because of the side effects of tardive dyskinesia and other problems, and we thought that the second-generation medications, all the atypicals, they were safer than the first generation. Now,
yes, but that turns out not to be true in the Cady study. It turns out that the perfenazine, which turns out to have the same adverse event profile, costs 1/10 as much and is more effective than several of the others.
And that's the quote-unquote old drug versus
the old
these
drug.
new
That's the old
atypical
drug
drugs.
that
what they were doing.
plaintiffs' attorneys used to sue manufacturers over as well.
Not really.
I mean, every drug that's put on the market has a lawsuit attached to it because there's something wrong with it.
I never filed a suit on perfenazine, and I don't know anybody who did.
Well,
I'd like to interject something as well.
Go ahead, Dr. Kruszewski.
Yeah, I want to continue on the point about the Cady trial. The Cady trial was a publication, the first part of which came out in September 22nd, I believe, of 2005. About 9 months ago, give or take a few months, Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, who's the chair of psychiatry at Columbia, wrote an editorial, I believe published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, where he basically asked the question, how are we so duped by what we know now? How do we not know then? The trouble is the biochemistry to explain why some of the atypical antipsychotics cause problems with lipids and cause problems with metabolic syndrome. The problems with some of the drugs causing akathisia and tardive dyskinesia and extrapyramidal side effects. Those problems were identified. However, that information was sequestered, in some cases even sequestered from the Food and Drug Administration Administration. So not only do you have the Food and Drug Administration not doing its job as well as it could do, you also had the drug companies minimizing, omitting, or sequestering data that was supplied then to the FDA to act on. Why do I know this, by the way, should be an obvious question, is that I've seen much of the data from the Zyprexa, because I've worked as an expert, consulting expert for them. I've seen much of the data for some of the other atypicals as well. And it's appalling to me as a clinician and as a human being that that information was not transmitted and also not it couldn't have been acted on appropriately by any FDA panel, any neuropsychiatric panel that the FDA advisory board would have set up, because the information was not even provided to them.
Dr. Kruszewski, do you believe that doctors are getting misled to prescribe these drugs off-label?
I do.
All right, Dr. Sheikh, what do you think?
Well, I think it is a complex issue. If you look at I would say that the direct consumer advertisement has really affected that. Like, you would have patients walk into your office who would want a certain medication because that's what they saw on the TV. I think
they're not going to see an antipsychotic being promoted on television.
Well, you know, we're talking about the depression medication and other medication. However, there was just like a comment that I just wanted to make that has this affected the practice how medicines are being prescribed. Now,
yes.
in terms of I do want to talk about the first time when there was a study done with atypical Clozaril in early 1990s when it was used in schizophrenia in adolescents who were not responding to any other medication. Now, just using the same formula, you are going to see patients who are really, really sick and they have failed every other intervention, and you have to use some medication in it. Now, not every medication is for everyone. Obviously, if someone is having side effects, you will have to change the medication and try to find some other alternative.
Right, it's appropriate, obviously, but do you think that A, they're being overprescribed, and B, do you think that you as doctors are being misled sometimes by pharmaceutical companies? I mean, really a simple yes or no could probably work. I'm not trying to make this a cross-examination, but do you believe that, again, that you as a doctor have even been approached perhaps by pharmaceutical sales managers who you believe are trying to mislead you? Maybe yes, maybe no.
Okay, it's not a yes and no answer. I can speak for myself. Actually, pharmaceutical reps, they don't even come to the child psychiatrists. They don't even advertise to them. Believe it or not, at my agency, no one comes and talks to us because they are not allowed to do that.
What, don't they like child psychiatrists?
Yes. Well,
I mean, but why aren't they if this is happening, then why aren't they not approaching child psychiatrists?
Because they are not allowed to, because they know that they cannot approach a child psychiatrist for off-label prescription, because these drugs, I think Risperdal just got approved for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in children now,
yes.
And I think it was approved for agitation in autism. And this is the only atypical which is approved in children. So no pharmaceutical rep comes and visits the child psychiatrist
All right, let's get
place.
to some of your phone calls, folks. I know the half hour is running through quickly. We have some legal consequences we need to talk about as well. But let's go to Linda from Bethlehem first. Linda, you're up on Law Journal. What's your question?
Yes, I'm a mother of an autistic son. And I'd like to know, how did the Medical Association conclude that a drug like Risperdal, which is prescribed for schizophrenia, would benefit autistic children with ill-advised side effects?
Well, once again, it has not been approved on label, correct, for autism.
It is.
No,
it
is.
Is
No,
it?
it
is
is
now. It is now.
It's that
yes.
Tom Logren, that guy for the FDA, who deserves to be.
But that's new.
He deserves to be fired, in my opinion. It's been approved. It should never have been approved. What this drug does is horrendous. It causes children to grow breasts. It causes them to develop tardive dyskinesia, which is very similar to autism. Parkinsonian type syndrome, a lot of the symptoms, but worse yet, it masks the effect of the syndrome which is developing that it causes. So by the time it breaks through, there's often nothing you can do about it. So you're putting your children at grave risk using this drug. And how it got approved, I know that heads of the Autism Society, certain organizations, are very unhappy about that approval. How it got approved is mind-boggling.
And Ray Williams is
a
former NFL player.
Not in Great Britain.
Ray Williams is a former NFL player.
Britain.
But Steve, I know he wanted to tackle you at least twice in your last. A little quick. Go ahead, Raymond. What's your question?
I just think that for lawyers to pronounce that the FDA is ludicrous for approving drugs.
That's correct.
When they don't have a medical degree, when they haven't actually looked at the data, when they don't know,
sir.
and so you don't know what, in fact, the autistic child may need this benefit, and apparently it benefits them. But you're telling them today on TV live they shouldn't take it.
That's my
based
opinion.
on your medical degree.
All right, let's take a very quick look here at why plaintiff lawyers believe that consumers are losing ground in this game, and why they're, the entities that may be defendants in these kind of matters are enjoying certain protections. The pharmaceutical companies are provided with strong defense because the FDA, if they approve a drug, there's a notion of preemption. Also, doctors prescribing drugs, the pharmaceutical company can say the learned intermediary is responsible, not us. Doctors are provided some cover here because there's no informed consent, at least in Pennsylvania, for when it comes to prescribing drugs, and certainly with the FDA, there are sovereign governmental immunity. They enjoy governmental immunity. So again, Steve and Raymond would probably have different perspectives here, but at least from the plaintiff's viewpoint, Steve, it looks like you've got less ammunition in your gun than ever before.
You're absolutely right. The deck has been stacked against people such as the woman who called about her son with autism. If your son got Risperdal and developed tardive dyskinesia, and you weren't informed of that risk, therefore you accepted, nor were you aware that the risk of developing that Parkinsonian type syndrome and these other disease processes is very great, in excess of 10% in most instances, and it happened, you probably would have a very difficult time because it's been approved for children, so you got preemption for the drug company. Then the doctors got the learned intermediary defense, and what's really important about that, he had no obligation to warn you ahead of time about the risks of this drug. He didn't have to tell you a thing about it.
I like to interject here.
You've got 30 seconds, Doc. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I think that when we do informed consent, and American Academy has given the guidelines how you need to do the informed consent. When we prescribe these medications off-label, we actually tell the patient that these medications are not approved by FDA for this condition, and these are the side effects. But again, I'm going to make the case again. These parents and these children, they have failed everything else. There's nothing else to do. Maybe my colleague can tell me what else we shall do with them.
Go ahead, Dr. Kruszewski, 30 seconds.
My problem with informed consent is that you cannot even begin to provide informed consent if all of the risks are unknown to you. It is my belief, and I can back this up with the investigations that my staff and I continue to do on a day-by-day basis, that information that has been omitted, sequestered, or minimized does not provide a basis for informed consent. It does provide a basis for not believing that federal preemption should exist, because as long as you have federal preemption, you can't. You have an uneven playing field. It means that the people that I see that have been hurt and repeatedly harmed by certain misprescription of drugs can't take their case to an attorney. They can't take their case and seek redress in the legal system, and that's the last place that they could have justice and redress for the harms that have been imposed upon
Folks, here's what's coming up on our show over the next 3 weeks, and we want to remind you we are here every Monday night at 8 p.m. Dispensing law week to week, and also just a quick reminder as well that if you don't get all the information you've gotten here you needed tonight, we're going to be on the air for another half hour, and you can also go to our website, Law Journal. We're going to be off air. We're going to be taking your telephone calls for a half hour. You can go to our website, AmericanLawJournalTV.com, and again, every program that we produce here later goes up to our website as a webcast, brand new website for the American Law Journal. If you need more information, call us toll free, 888-78-LAW-TV. Write to us, info@lawjournaltv.com. Go to the website, get your law on demand. Again, we are here in the studio, we're leaving the air, but we want to remind you, continue calling for the next 30 minutes, 1-800-426-4625. We'll continue having our discussion here, taking your telephone calls for all of us here at Law Journal. At the American Law Journal, thank you for joining us here on this Constitution Day. We'll see you next Monday night. Good night now.
Tonight's American Law Journal has been made possible in part by Scheller PC, winning large verdicts for people injured by dangerous medicine, including antidepressants and antipsychotics, as well as medical malpractice and products liability claims, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida. Scheller, preserving the rights of the injured for over 30 years. And The Legal Intelligencer, the nation's oldest legal publication and daily newspaper for lawyers.